Hi, everybody. Hope everyone's doing okay on this Labor Day weekend. It is actually Sunday here, so I'm filming this, recording this today, and I'll have it up for Monday, Labor Day. We're technically not meeting, but I decided to make a video anyway. And if you wanted to watch it in your spare time, you certainly can. So again, this is MU112, Market Choral Society, which is actually an online course this semester. Studying some major choral works. This week, and part of the reason why I'm so excited about this is because this week we're covering one of my favorite pieces by a very, not well-known composer, Lily Boulanger, and it's called Soir sur la plaie. And I've sung it, I've not conducted it, although it's on my list possibly for next semester. But you have to have a very, very fine pianist, which we luckily have. I really just didn't want to miss an opportunity to talk about this piece, especially by a female composer that was operating 100 years ago, working 100 years ago, in what I imagine would be some pretty tough circumstances. So I'll start out talking about women in music in the 20th century, which was not unheard of. In fact, oddly enough, Hildegard of Bingen was probably one of the most famous women composers that we have in Western music history, and she was operating in the Middle Ages, where women had zero rights, right? So, and then of course there were the ladies of Ferrari and operating in the Renaissance. So we have a lot of women that did sort of pave the way. They certainly were not. They certainly were met with some major roadblocks, and that's what I'm going to talk about here first in this first slide. So things are changing in the 19th century. Things are getting a little bit better for women. Obviously, in the early 20th century, American women got the right to vote. Slowly but surely, the structural things that were put in place to prevent women from working, from say producing art, we're slowly starting to ebb away because of radical changes in government and things like that. The climate was not ripe for women composers. There were very, very few. They simply could not compete with men, although there are some exceptions. Amy Beach is one. She was an American composer who did quite well, although one could argue that while she was married, although it was a childless marriage, she did eventually start producing music once her husband died. So she was much more productive as a single woman than she was as a married woman. And of course, she was also in America. Clara Schumann, of course, managed to compose, even though she had about 8 children and a husband who was very mentally ill. So she's a little bit of an exception because she did publish some music. We have another woman from England, Dame Ethel Smythe, who had some fame in Germany. She was British, but she did have an opera premiere in Leipzig in the early 20th century. So there certainly are some exceptions. They're small in number, and there probably are more that we just don't even know about because nobody bothered to write it down. So what does this all mean? Feminism in the arts? Well, things started to change, of course, in the 1960s when feminism actually became a thing. And it already was there in academia, certainly. People were writing about it already, but it became a cultural movement in the 1960s. And certainly musicologists started then to think about, well, there must have been women composers. If there were male composers, there must have been women composers. So they started to do some digging, and musicology started to sort of create its own corner for females in the arts. I'm just going to talk a little bit first about just women in the arts in general. So in the 1970s, when this started to become a really big deal, a woman by the name of Linda Nachlin wrote an article. And she was an art historian, so we're not necessarily just talking only about musicians, but all art, the entire field of the arts, so literature, architecture, um, paint, visual art, music, etc. She says the article was called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" She just asked the question, and this is in 1971. She posits that the concept of male machismo, which is a Spanish word, but we sort of think of that now as the male ego, right? Puffing out their chest and sort of showing everyone that they're stronger and better than everyone else, really got in the way of women also, and in effect actually hurt art on the whole. So it not only affected women artists in that they really couldn't even get beyond certain levels because men were just kind of in the way, and their voices, female voices, were not allowed to be heard, but also that it affected art as a whole. So the concept of machismo and the male ego got in the way of art in general. So in other words, the art that they produced under such circumstances probably wasn't as good as it could have been had they been more open-minded. So this is her supposition, not necessarily the book that I was quoting, but Taruskin, from the Oxford History of Western Music, says later that this idea of greatness, which of course is sort of put into the minds of all young men as they are growing older, was not something that women were accustomed to. Women, of course, had to make a choice. Either you're going to stay home and you're going to be with your kids and your family, or you're going to have a career. Those are your two choices. And in some ways, that still is the case. I was certainly under the impression as a young professional that I had to make a choice. I was either going to be a professional or I was going to be a wife and a mother. Now, I see younger colleagues doing both, and I know they're incredibly busy, but they're also killing it. So, can you have it all? Maybe now you can. I don't know. Things are changing for the better, certainly. But in the 1970s, as they're researching this, there was still a giant gap. Certainly, there was a giant gap in the early 1900s when Lily Boulanger was creating her art. So, why did this happen? Well, Taruskin says the concept of greatness is connected to a cultural analysis and rests in part on self-assertion and competition. So there's a certain amount of competitiveness that a woman had to have in order to be great. But those traits, of course, were not desirable in a woman in the early 20th century. Even now, to a certain extent, those traits are not desirable in a woman. So how do we make that happen? How do we allow women to be great and create great art? I think that is the big question, and something that we all have to work on within ourselves. And I think it's not just up to women anymore. It has to be up to men too, to sort of pave the way for us. So these are bigger questions. And, when you look back, when I do this research and I look back at all the females and I think back on all of the women that could have had careers and could have been great, it's actually pretty sad, right? So this is, I think, just a good lesson that we were able to have someone like Lily Boulanger, and she was able to thrive in spite of all of that, but she also had a few tricks up her sleeve, and she had some men in her corner. So I'll just read this quote here. There are no great women artists because women are socially barred from greatness. And that was definitely the case in Lily Boulanger's time. Her sister Nadia, we'll talk about this, definitely felt the effects of that, and sort of got pigeonholed into being a teacher rather than composer. Lily had some success in spite of it, but we'll go on and talk a little bit more about France. So operating in France was a little different than, say, operating in the United States or in Germany or in any other country in the world. France was a little bit ahead of its time when it comes to feminism. So women as composers as early as the 1800s were socially acceptable. The ban on women participating in competitions, for instance, was lifted, first in painting, then in music. Eventually, women were allowed to compete in a very prestigious competition called the Prix de Rome in 1903. And this competition had many different categories. You could participate in art, visual art, music, architecture, literature, many different categories. So Lily Boulanger, of course, would compete in the Prix de Rome in composition, and then she would win, and she would actually be the first woman to ever win. But there's a catch: she had to share the title with a man. So, but we still say she's the first woman to win, even though it was a tie. Sadly, her sister tried 4 different times, and where most of the judges said that her work was the absolute best, she still, for some reason, came in second. But moving on, part of the reason why these things were happening in France was because their arts academies and their universities in France were removing these barriers years before, little by little, these structural barriers, so that women would actually be accepted and they would meet the criteria. Because often what happened was they would just set the bar so high that there was no way that a woman could actually reach it. And men, of course, were predisposed. They had access to private lessons. They had access to teachers. They had access to instruments. They had access to money. Women didn't have access to these things. Slowly but surely, this started to change, and women had more access, and then people actually started to look at them seriously as artists and allowed them into their universities, and therefore there was some competition there for men. Okay, so over the course of the early 20th century, there were actually 4 female finalists for the Prix de Rome Prize. 2 of them were sisters, Nadia and Lily Boulanger, as I mentioned before. Lily was the younger of the 2, and she's the one that actually won, so she was considered the first woman to win the prize, but it was a tie with another male competitor. Her father won it in 1835. He had his children when he was in his 70s, so he was quite a bit older than them. But he won in 1835. Debussy won it. Many prominent French composers, but others as well, have won that prize. It had a pretty big name and a lot attached to it, so it was a very big deal that Lily won it in 1913, I believe, is when she won it. As I said, Nadia competed 4 times, and even though the judges said she was the best, she still kept coming 4 times. She came up as the second runner-up. So that had to be a little frustrating, I imagine, for Nadia. Okay, let's talk about Lily, who is the subject of our lecture today. We will talk about Nadia too, because you can't really talk about Lily without talking about her older sister. Tragically, Lily died very young. She only lived until 1918. Not quite sure what was wrong. They think she had Crohn's disease, so she was chronically ill. But she also suffered from some kind of lung disease, either chronic bronchitis, something to do with a lung disease. We're not quite sure what actually killed her in the end, but she was not a healthy person either way. Actually, when she first entered the Prix de Rome in 1912, she had to withdraw. She actually collapsed during her performance of her piece, and she probably would have won that year, but she ended up getting very, very sick. And then she came back the next year, the following year, and won it. So her full name is Marie Juliette Olga Lily Boulanger. So Lily is her nickname. And so she won it at the age of 20, which is just remarkable. And from what I understand, they had to sit in these little cubicles and write so that they couldn't cheat. And so she just pops out this cantata and wins. It's pretty remarkable. So she won for her version of Faust, basically, based on Goethe's text. She, like many other French composers, were very influenced at this time by the Wagnerian style. And of course, I'm talking about Richard Wagner of German fame, of Siegfried and Parsifal, the Ring Cycle fame. They were very obsessed with this very German, highly romantic sound, which made her music very difficult. So at this point, she was writing a little bit more in that Wagnerian style and toward the romantic side of things. Later on, and even later on in that year, she starts to mimic what we like to call the Impressionist style, although that's really not the word we use in music. We use that really more in the visual arts. But Debussy, Ravel, those guys, she starts to emulate more of that sound, the French style. And of course, I mentioned here also won the Prix de Rome, but she looked up to him very much and emulated his style. So the piece that we're actually going to study, you'll hear more of the Debussy sound. As I said, she composed very little. Her output was very small. One, because she didn't live very long, but two, because she was ill most of the time. And sadly, she died at the age of 24. Let's talk about her older sister. So Nadia Boulanger lived quite a long life. She was probably more famous for being a teacher of composition, because she taught most of the males the most famous male composers. So Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, and tons of other Americans, and people from all over the world. So she was a teacher of composition, known primarily for that, but she was also a conductor. And after her sister died, she took it upon herself to really champion her sister's works and conduct them, program them, conduct them. One of which is Soir sur le Plain, which she eventually conducted, and that's why we know it. If it weren't for Nadia, we wouldn't know this piece. So let's talk a little bit about Soir sur le Plain. I should say, too, this is not going to be a very long lecture today. This piece is only 8.5 minutes long. So I hope you enjoy. I'm enjoying a French glass of rosé. No, actually, it's not French. It's from Sonoma County, California. Francis Coppola. Actually, side note, Francis Coppola, if you ever get to Sonoma County, go to that winery. It's kind of like Disney World. It's insanity. It's humongous. And it's got all of Coppola's film memories, like the car from Tucker and the Dracula outfit and all this stuff. But anyway, little hint, if you go upstairs to the bar, don't go downstairs where it's free, because that's really, really busy. Go upstairs to the bar and you pay $10 per person for wine tasting, and you get to taste all of their reserve wines. Highly recommend. Okay, just a little side note. Let's get back to Soir sur le Plain. Written shortly after she won the Prix de Rome in 1913. Translates to Evening on the Plain. So we're thinking about grass plains here, right? France has them too. Think about farming. The portion of France that is not necessarily grapes, but farming, right? Cows, milk, cheese. She dedicated it to a friend of hers in memory of Raoul Puño, who was a great friend of theirs, and he was also a really, really fine pianist. And there's a reason why they did that, and that's because this piece, although it was originally scored for orchestra, soprano solo, there are some tenor solos, chorus, and orchestra, she had another version in which she just reduced the orchestration for piano. And that is the version that is probably most widely done, but it's also extremely difficult for the piano, so you gotta have a really, really good accompanist. And that's why she dedicated it to her friend, who was a virtuoso pianist. The text, symbolist, poet, Albert Samin, he paints sort of an impressionist style picture, even though he's a symbolist. The way he paints the sky is, if you're thinking of twilight, so as the sun is going down on the plains and the sky becomes black along with the blackness of the plains, and it's this meeting of the two that he sort of captures this moment, and she does as well with the music. And once the sun has set in this piece, then suddenly the chorus has no more words. It's a wordless chorus toward the end of the piece where they just hum. Beautifully done. So she's definitely kind of taking us on an 8.5 minute journey. It may seem like, as Impressionists often do, it's what we call non-teleological. So there is no trajectory. You're just sort of wandering through these places tonally, harmonically, melodically. There's no real cohesiveness to the music and even to the poetry. potentially. When you look at art, impressionist art, you can't really tell what it is until you kind of go far away, but if you get too close, and that's sort of the same with this music. It has no real direction, but she actually takes us through a little bit of a narrative that she has created, which is going from dusk to finally twilight and then darkness. Okay. All right, here is the translation. I'll just read it to you, although I'm going to kind of talk you through it as we're listening. I hope you can listen on your own to the whole piece, because I'm going to end up stopping it a bunch, and that really breaks up the flow, because it's meant to be heard, of course, as one solid piece. But I want to stop at certain moments and bring up the text so understand what's happening at that moment. Evening on the plain. Toward the west there the sky is all golden. Across the deserted pasture where the path falls, the penetrating odor of cut hay exhales, and it is the emotive hour when the earth sleeps. The scythe of the harvester has passed over the land, and rest follows the work of long days. An occasional plow, forgotten from labor, leaves like an uplifted arm from the solitary furrows. The night in an east sprinkles its fine ashes. Alone, in setting, lingers a glow of fire. And in the darkness, which grows little by little, the whiteness of the road is difficult to define. So you can see the sun setting. It's just like our summer nights, right? At 9:30 when the sun finally sets. Then all becomes somber and thrusts into a great unity. The sky, darkened, rejoins the immense plain. Listen, a great sigh crosses the silence, and behold how the heart of the day has ceased. And that's when she moves into the wordless chorus and finishes up the piece. Okay, so now we get to listen to this tremendously beautiful composition. Okay, I'm going to pull up, so this is the recording that I chose. It's my alma mater, surprise, surprise. As I mentioned, I sang this with my late husband back when we were the USC Thornton Chamber Choir, when we were on tour in Asia in 2006. So I got to know this piece really, really well because we sang it so many times. And Bill would have the sopranos alternate. I was not one of them. I'm not a soprano. I can't float those high A's. Cannot do that. Anyway, it was, and we had an amazing accompanist. Her name was Hae Young Kim. I'll never forget her. Absolutely, and that's why Bill chose that piece. He knew what he had in her, so that is critical. As you can see here, this is the USC Thornton Chamber Singers. When Bill retired and Mike took over, he increased the number to 32. When I was in it, there were only 24 singers. Now he has 32 singers, and he changed the name to Chamber Singers. The accompanist, incredible. The opening soprano, Megan Workman, really, really beautiful. So I chose this particular recording for a couple reasons. One, because I'm proud of my alma mater. Two, because it's really, really well done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start it, and then I'm going to pull up a PDF of the score so you can follow along. I'll do the best I can to pull down without giving you vertigo, and also stopping intermittently to discuss the translation. So I'm not going to be able to mute because I have to be able to hear. So hopefully the echo isn't horrible. So let's begin. Here we go. right, I'm going to stop it right there. So she just sang the first verse, actually the first three lines of the first stanza, which is, toward the west there, the sky is all golden. Across the deserted pasture where the path falls, the penetrating odor of cut hay exhales, exhale, right? And then the chorus comes in right here. And it is the emotive hour when the earth sleeps. So I shall start this one more time and we'll go back. And then from there, the chorus takes over. And again, if you want, listen to the harmonies. She's very clearly in B major in 5 sharps. But it's extremely chromatic. In fact, the opening chord is a 1 chord. It's the tonic, but it's minor, and then she diminishes the 5th, and then she adds the 7th. So this is very much the French Romanticism, French modernism, that creates that, like I said, that non-teleological. There's a lack of direction, but it paints a picture and a feeling and a timbre for us, which makes it pair so well with this particular poem. I mean, you can almost see the sun going down, the twilight, that golden hour when the sun is just going down and it meets the horizon. And then sorry, it was my door slamming from this windstorm. And then we have the twilight come, and then finally darkness. So let's start this again. I'm going to rewind just a smidge so that we can get back into the chorus. Okay? B major. And we start the second stanza. Sorry, I'm going to start again. I forget that she lets the soloist do the first verse and then the chorus does the first verse. So we're going to back that up one more time so you can hear the soloist. Let me move my cursor here. So as you can tell, so she sings the first verse and then they take over with the last line of the first verse, first stanza, whatever you want to call it. And then the chorus takes over. So I'm going to try to sync this up so we can get this about right there. Hour when the earth sleeps. to pause right there. So the piano plays as much as an important role as the voices do, or the orchestra, whichever version you do, they are part of the makeup. So you can see here that she does all these triplets in the left hand. She's using this chromatic to sort of think about increments, right? So the increment of the sunset, how it sets, and it's barely noticeable, but you know it's happening, right? Same thing with these chromatics, going up and going down, going up and going down. This is very much that French style in the 20th century. If you listen to any Debussy, if you listen to The Afternoon of a Faun, or Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. I'm trying to think of some of the other big ones. Daphne St. Chloe by Ravel. I mean, you can hear the sun rise in Daphne St. Chloe, right? You could hear it, and that's exactly what she's doing here. So let's start again. So she takes a little departure there for the second verse. She takes a slight departure into 3/4, right? And then we add the tenor, and he brings us to that new key just for a second. And then we end back up in 4 with that chromatic line back, that familiar theme back in the left hand one more time. Here we go. This is verse 3. Just in the women. Right there. She settles us back into 3/4, and technically we're back into that key. We're back into the key of 5 sharps, but notice what she does there. She's got G in the bottom, so basically we have a G minor 7. Okay, let's go. So she's still working on these verses. I think it's really fascinating and beautiful how she takes the women in that 3rd verse. The night in the east sprinkles its fine ashes. Alone in setting lingers a glow of fire, and the darkness which grows little by little. And takes the male voices out of it and lets that lightness. It reminds me very much of Debussy and La Mer. If you've ever done those big orchestral pieces and sung the chorus in some of that stuff, just absolutely wonderful. Debussy has another piece too that's just for women in orchestra with 2 soprano soloists, and it is just, it reminds me a lot of this. It's just absolutely stunning. All right, let me see if I can line this up one more time and get back to just a little bit to where the soloist begins here. Again, here we go. So that's the first line of the fourth stanza. Then all becomes somber and thrusts into a great, I'm trying to read my translation here, unité. And of course, we changed key. We're always moving, right? It feels like the ground is sort of moving out from underneath us. It's very hard to almost find home. And that's the idea of this non-teleological movement that happens in a lot of this French music. All right, let's continue here and pay close attention to when she goes to the wordless chorus. So first we have to talk about, listen, a great sigh crosses the silence, and behold how the heart of the day has ceased, the day is finally done, and then la bouche fermée, yeah? Is that closed mouth? I think that's usually what is in the text, or marked in the music, so you'll see when it comes here. All right. Absolutely a gorgeous, gorgeous piece. I'm just looking through here. So you can see here, I was just kind of scrolling back, you can see here she takes the piano accompaniment and puts it into the men's voice, the male voices. Tenor, bass, and bass 2, she splits into 3, so you actually have 6-part harmony. And then the sopranos and the altos come back and do the exact same thing. Okay. Just an absolutely, absolutely gorgeous piece. I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you will take a listen on your own, do a little bit of research, learn about Lily, learn about Nadia, and some more female composers and conductors in this field, and we'll be back next week to talk more about music. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.